Welcome to episode 7 of Trailblazer 2 Traveler, which is also the first episode where I take a new step in the direction of the series and its concepts. Today, we're going to be covering Ruan Mei. She's a general buffer and support in the world of HSR, but for the world of T2T, she'll make her debut as a specialized Bloom-based unit and buffer. We'll also be using a revamped mechanic from my Harmony Trailblazer episode, which I call Break Formulas. Before we begin, disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, music credits, and a link to my Discord server are all down below. Captions are available if you need them. Alright, without further ado, let's get started. So for this video, here's a little bit of a glossary. We're going to be talking a lot about Bloom-related stuff, so here are some terms I might throw around in the video. A Bloom-based team is every single team that uses Bloom, Hyper Bloom, or Burgeon. Meanwhile, if I ever specify a pure Bloom team, it's any Bloom team where regular Bloom damage is the main source, and it doesn't include Hyper Bloom or Burgeon. This can be regular Bloom teams, it can also be Nilou Bloom teams, or it could even be variants like Shatter Bloom. And just to prepare you in advance, you'll see the terms Break Formula or Break Bonus later on, which I will explain right after this. Raw damage is also making a debut as a mechanic, which will also be explained later in this video. Now, let's cover what a break formula or break bonus is. I have to pray to the teaching gods for this one, because the stuff I'm about to explain is so complex. Even Genshin players who know how to read are gonna get confused by this. So, I hope I explain this properly. For those who didn't see my updated overview video, break formulas are supposed to be similar to the formula for Lunar Charged. It takes into account all units who contributed to the reaction, and will add up their respective reaction damage into a pool. Additionally, while Lunar Charged uses crit bonuses for the reaction, break formulas are going to use elemental damage bonuses. This bonus gets added to the EM bonus section, so if you usually build a character with full EM, you aren't incentivized to run an elemental damage goblet instead. But it does mean DPS-focused units like Arlecchino or Yelan get a bit more value from elemental damage now. Their EM baseline is lower, so the elemental damage bonus actually provides more value to that damage gap. And on top of that, you still have their personal damage to benefit from. Just like Lunar Charged, transformative break reactions use a pooled formula where it takes the highest damage from the top contributor, half the damage from the second highest, and then 1/12 from any other possible contributors. This is the case for most break transformative reactions, but Bloom will be slightly different. In Genshin, we have forward and reverse variants of a Bloom reaction. If you have a Hydro Aura and use a Dendro trigger, you create a Bloom core, but consume the entire Hydro Aura in the process. This is what we usually call a forward Bloom. If you have a Dendro Aura and trigger with Hydro, you create a Bloom core, but only consume half the Dendro Aura, allowing you to trigger Bloom a second time with the same Dendro Aura. This is a reverse Bloom. Technically, there's other factors with elemental gauge and auras changing when other elements are involved, but the simple example is, Dendro on Hydro creates one Dendro core, while Hydro on Dendro creates two Dendro cores. The reason why it's like this is likely due to the fact that Dendro characters scale with elemental mastery. So when they trigger Bloom, their cores deal more damage. Most Hydro units don't build for EM, so their cores deal less damage, but to make up for it, they can create double the cores. Why this matters for my break formula is because if we follow the exact same pattern as Lunar Charged, it wouldn't matter whether a Dendro character or a Hydro character triggers Bloom. The Dendro unit's EM will likely be the highest contribution, and regardless of trigger, the damage of the cores would be exactly the same. If the auras don't change either, this basically means your reverse Bloom teams are going to deal double the Bloom damage as a forward Bloom team. To make sure we maintain the significance of auras and triggers, here's how a break Bloom formula will work. If you apply Dendro onto Hydro, the Dendro unit's EM will contribute the full amount of Bloom damage, while the Hydro only contributes half. If we do Hydro on Dendro, it's flipped. The Hydro unit's EM is its full amount, while the Dendro unit will deal half. Here's an example of how the math would look. A forward Bloom takes the full contribution of a Dendro unit and half of the Hydros, resulting in a high instance of damage. But you can only generate one core. Meanwhile, a reverse bloom takes the full hydro and half the dendro, resulting in a lower damage hit. But since you can make 2 cores, you double that and end up with a damage instance that's higher than forward bloom, but not by an amount that's simply double the damage. The main purpose I have for break formulas is purely to allow units who act as an aura to still contribute some kind of value to their respective reactions. But I am perfectly fine and capable of balancing the numbers to address certain aura mechanics, such as a reverse or forward reaction. Now, we can get into Ranmei's kit. Her element is going to be Hydro. Despite being considered an ice character in HSR, her ult animation has a lot of water-based imagery. So, you know, Hydro. For her weapon, I'm going to make her a bow user. Her tool in HSR is her string instrument. So I decided that string object equals bow. We already have instrument bows like Elegy, Skyward Harp, or Stringless, so the idea of Ranmei having a similar design isn't that much of a stretch. Being a character with break effect as a stat scaling, as well as a unit who is repurposed to be a bloom-based character, she's going to ascend with Elemental Mastery. Let's look at her abilities now, and I'm going to go a bit out of order. We're going to start with a special A0 passive, which is just a passive you can get at level 1. While Ranmei is in the party, Bloom damage now benefits from break reaction bonuses. However, Hyperbloom and Burgeon do not get this benefit. Basically, if you play Ranmei in a pure Bloom team, Dendro cores will deal damage with the benefits of a break bonus. Playing in Hyperbloom or Burgeon means the cores act as usual, where the damage only scales on the Electro or Pyro unit's EM. Does this mean Ranmei is unplayable in these teams? No. I made a special workaround mechanic to allow her to use Break Bloom bonuses without disrupting her Bloom team flexibility. This is an ability that will be covered in her A1, but first we have a second part to this A0 passive. Taking a page out of Emily's book, party members gain an 85% Dendro resistance bonus against Bloom damage, but not including Hyperbloom or Burgeon damage. As of right now, characters only take 5% of the Bloom core damage from all 3 reactions. Hyperbloom and Burgeon are relatively easy to survive, while Nilou teams might be a bit more difficult, but still survivable. Ranmei's break formula bonus doesn't affect Hyperbloom or Burgeon, so the self-damage you take shouldn't change. But, in some kind of a pure Bloom team, especially a Nilou team, the Dendro cores and Bountiful cores are still considered as Bloom damage. If Ranmei triggers Bloom, she has EM scaling, which is going to create a strong baseline with Bloom damage. You're also taking into account break formulas, which means the Dendro unit who acted as an aura also contributes Bloom damage for Bloom. If they were also EM scaling, this is a significant base damage increase. Then we have to further take into account Nilou's A4 passive that buffs Bountiful cores, and in general, what I calculated for a Nilou Bloom core is pretty strong, and the self-inflicted damage looks to be around 2,000 damage per Dendro core. Basically, I designed this kit with Nilou actually being a synergistic unit, but I didn't want to force a decision where Nilou and Ranmei are a dangerous combo for your team. With this resistance bonus, each Bloom core should only deal around 400 damage, and in a non-Nilou team, break bonuses still make the cores pretty strong, so a self-hit is around 300 damage with this bonus. Overall, if you run a team where Bloom cores deal regular Bloom damage, this allows Ranmei to buff that damage while reducing the risk of dying. Moving on, instead of going into her skill, I'm going to jump over to her A1 passive, because I feel it's a lot more relevant to her kit. Mentally prepare yourselves, by the way, because this section is pretty dense in my opinion. Okay, here we go. When Bloom is triggered, Ranmei will create a Blossoming Bud that follows the active character around. Blossoming Buds will have a radius and will scan for nearby Dendro cores. When a core is created within the radius, the Blossoming Bud will record the damage it would theoretically deal if or when it explodes. If I were to create a Bloom core with a break bonus, that core would already have a set damage value based on elemental mastery, bloom damage bonuses, elemental damage bonuses, and adjusts itself based on the triggering element. This damage value is already set in stone when you make the core, and Ranmei's Blossoming Bud will take that damage value and absorb it into the bud. The Bloom core and break bonuses already served their purpose when the core was created, which means you can do whatever you want with the core itself. If I trigger Hyper Bloom or Burgeon, it'll turn into that damage type, and it would no longer benefit from break bonuses. But the damage of the Bloom core was already recorded with break buffs in mind, and this means it won't affect Ranmei's kit in any negative way. The Blossoming Bud can also scan and record damage values instantly. Nilou blooms are still considered as Dendro cores and explode after 0.4 seconds, which is still longer than instantly. As such, Ranmei will be able to work in a Nilou team. So what do you do with all of this damage that gets recorded from the Bloom cores? After 5 seconds, the core will take the combined damage value and deal raw Dendro damage based on the amount recorded. What is raw Dendro damage? This instance of damage is only going to be affected by Dendro resistance on an enemy, as well as any direct buffs to Blossoming Buds. It's similar to Ocean Hued Clam's Bubble Explosion, where it's a physical hit of damage, only affected by enemy physical resistance. It also won't apply a Dendro aura, and we're not considering it as a Bloom damage hit. This is because the damage recorded was already taking Bloom bonuses into account. Considering Blossoming Bud as Bloom damage would result in a very complicated double-dipping effect. There's an added benefit to this though. Because it's not Bloom damage, it won't deal damage to your party members, which is very good, because the more Bloom damage you record, the more damage the Bud does, and self-damage in a single combined instance could one-shot some units. Okay, with me so far? Good. Because I could have stopped there with that Blossoming Bud mechanic, but there's more. The Bud will not record a Bloom core's full damage. The first core will have its full damage recorded. As for the rest, I'll explain it in two ways. The simple version, for general gameplay knowledge, is that every Bloom core after the first will record a percentage of their damage, and as cores are generated, the percentage recorded will be less and less. So, in this 5-second interval between Bud explosions, cores generated in the latter half are recorded with significantly lower damage contribution. That is the simple version. Here's the complicated version. The formula for percentage decay is that cores record a portion of Bloom damage based on 90% of the previous multiplier that was recorded. I am a creative media major, so I don't remember a lot of math terms past, like, Algebra 1. And since I didn't have to take higher level math for my major, I have not even taken trig or calculus. Which is why this part's a lot harder for me to explain and simplify. But according to the internet, which is completely trustworthy 100% of the time, the formula I used was called exponential regression. I hope that is the right term. Here's the example. Let's just assume every Bloom core is the same damage of, 10,000, just to keep it simple. The first core will have a recorded value of 100%, making its recorded damage 10,000. The second core will record 90% of that original multiplier. 90% of 100% is 90%. So the second core records 90% of 10,000, which is 9,000 damage. The third core records 90% of that previous multiplier, which was 90%. 90% of 90% is 81%, so the third core records 81% of 1,000 damage, which is 8,100 damage. We keep this pattern going, which results in a heavy damage drop-off early on, but it'll start to plateau as more cores are generated. This is what it looks like on a graph. Steep falls in the beginning, but levels out over time. The reason I did this was because if you were to run a pure Bloom team instead of Hyper Bloom or Burgeon, all the damage recorded would basically be a mirrored value, resulting in the Bud exploding and dealing the same amount of damage as the rest of your Blooms. In other words, it flat out doubled Bloom damage. I didn't want to do a flat percent scaling, since it would feel a bit too much like HSR's true damage mechanic, which I low-key find boring. I also didn't want to do a linear regression because that means at some point, you hit 0 on the recording value. This curved regression means that even if you trigger 50, 100, 1,000 cores, you never hit 0%, and every core contributes some type of damage value. With everything said and done, the way we calculate a Blossoming Bud's damage afterwards is super simple. You take the combined damage of the recorded bloom damage for the base damage value, which is multiplied by any damage percent bonuses we'll cover down the line, and finally, you take into account whatever the enemy's damage resistance was. So yeah, that's her A1 passive. Lots of math for this one, but it is ironically within Ranmei's character because she is a member of the Genius Society. Whew, that was a lot to take in, wasn't it? Fortunately, the rest of the kit design should be trivially straightforward by comparison. With her A4 passive, every time a Blossoming Bud explodes, Ranmei regenerates 3 energy. This can occur once every 4 seconds. Additionally, if enemies within a Blossoming Bud take Pyro or Electro damage, the following buffs will occur for that next instance of Bud explosion. If they take Pyro damage, it increases the damage of the Bud by 12% per stack. This bonus can stack once every 1 second, and stacks reset upon a Bud exploding. If they take Electro damage, you decrease the timer of the Blossoming Bud duration by 0.6 seconds. This can be decreased once every 1 second. With this passive, it addresses some of Ranmei's energy needs, especially in a solo Hydro comp. The other part of it is that when you decide to run Hyper Bloom or Burgeon, you inherently lose on the break bonus for your cores. But now, Ranmei can use these elements to buff her Blossoming Bud damage as a result. A Burgeon team with someone like Thoma will trigger Burgeon at most 4 times in a 5-second interval, allowing you to increase the Bud damage by 48%. To show you the formula again, this is the damage bonus I mentioned earlier for direct Bud buffs. So this 48% bonus is calculated after adding the base damage from recorded Bloom cores. Burgeon teams now allow Bud damage to be much higher per hit. On the Electro side, I calculated that you can trigger the Electro effect 3 times before the timer runs out. Instead of exploding every 5 seconds, we're looking at around 3.2 seconds per Bud explosion. This records less Bloom damage, but you deal more frequent hits. You also reset the damage drop-off with each explosion, so this would result in higher overall damage compared to its baseline. Depending on how you time the Bud explosion, you might end up with more or even less instances of the energy regen occurring, so you'd have to be mindful of that factor for energy needs. In short, this passive means that Ranmei will have differing benefits when you run a Pure Bloom, Burgeon, or Hyper Bloom team. More on that in the team comp section. Ranmei's skill deals AoE Hydro damage and applies Overtone to the party. While Overtone is active, party members gain one of the following effects based on their elemental mastery. If EM is below 350, it will increase elemental damage percent of their element. If EM is above 350, we're going to further increase EM by a flat amount. The ability itself is straightforward, so this section is going to cover why I made the changes I did. Her HSR skill grants a universal damage bonus and a weakness break efficiency bonus. I decided to convert the universal bonus into an elemental one to better synergize with the break mechanic. Since reactions now benefit from elemental damage, a character can contribute extra reaction damage with the first part of the bonus. As for the weakness break, the most literal translation would be elemental shield breaking. But enemy shields aren't a universal mechanic unlike HSR's weakness break. To avoid Ranmei having some weird shield breaking niche, I instead allowed her to grant a flat EM bonus, which is directly synergistic with her intended Bloom teams. Because it's a flat bonus and not a percent bonus, other percent bonuses for EM, such as Nahida's A1, can utilize Ranmei's EM buff when boosting the party. My idea for an EM threshold between the bonuses was due to the fact that certain units in a team might have differing roles. Because of the break formulas, EM and damage percent will still be relevant for every unit's reaction contribution, but some characters will have more value leaning into one stat versus the other. Units like Xingqiu will likely build around personal damage, while reaction units like Kaveh or Nahida benefit more from EM. The skill is also a snapshotting buff, not a dynamic one. So if you have a character who is below 350 EM when Ranmei uses her skill, they get the damage percent bonus. If in the middle of this duration, they get a buff that makes them go above 350 EM, the bonus will not swap over. They keep the damage percent they started with, and this goes the other way around. For final notes, it will have a 15-second duration, an 18-second cooldown, and generate 5 particles upon the casting dealing damage. Moving on to her burst, Ranmei deploys a field. For a bit of inconvenient balancing, I'm going to say that the field will have a large radius, but will not follow the active character. While enemies are in the field, they will be afflicted with Thantiplume Rebloom. Thantiplume Rebloom decreases Dendro and Hydro resistance. Additionally, when Bloom is triggered, enemies take Dendro damage, or enemies take damage from a Bloom core, including Hyper Bloom and Burgeon. Ranmei will deal AoE Hydro damage based on her attack and EM. This can occur once every 2 seconds, and this cooldown is independent among enemies. The ICD is our standard 2.5 second and 3 hit ICD. The hits of AoE Hydro damage are relatively large, and once again, target each enemy with independent cooldowns. So if enemies are all within range of each other, it's possible for them to have the Rebloom trigger on all of them, and they can all hit each other to bypass the ICD much quicker. This allows for faster application and bloom generation, and with Ranmei being EM scaling, her personal bloom damage is a lot more relevant. This ability will have a 16-second duration, an 18-second cooldown, and a 70 energy cost. While this ability has some personal damage, its main purpose is Hydro application and the resistance shred. Since it's tied to her burst, there are important energy factors at play if you want her to be a solid applicator. For our next section, let's cover her best builds. For artifact stats, you're either running full EM across the board, or you run the Sands with energy recharge. Her burst is her main source of Hydro application, so it's super important to ensure that she can use it every rotation. A double Hydro comp will be a lot friendlier on Ranmei's ER requirements, ranging around 175 to 210%. Solo Hydro, especially without the Fav, were as low as 190, but reached hefty peaks of 230% to 250% in those really bad energy scenarios. When it comes to artifact sets, low investment options can be a 2-piece combo, mixing up stats for either ER or EM. Every other 2-piece effect isn't that good in my opinion. For 4-piece sets, you could start off with Emblem. It has an ER stat and a burst damage bonus scaling with ER, which Ranmei does need to build, but even though her burst damage is present in battle, it's not her main source of damage. That 2-piece combo of ER and EM I mentioned earlier is objectively going to be a stronger synergy, with reactions being her main source of damage. A pretty good domain to farm efficiently is the one for Gilded and Deepwood. Gilded is a really good set for Ranmei, allowing her to stack up a lot of EM. Since there may be scenarios where solo Hydro is a thing, she can get the full 230 EM from this set. On the flip side, if your team doesn't have a Deepwood user, her being a Bloom-based support allows your team to deal higher damage for all Bloom-based hits. Finally, Flower of Paradise Lost is a set she is designed to work with. Once again, even in teams where you trigger Hyper Bloom or Burgeon, regular Bloom damage bonuses are considered when recording damage for the Blossoming Bud. When Ranmei triggers Bloom, that 80% bonus she gets is still utilized. In short, Pure Bloom teams maximize her synergy with this set, but it's still consistent even in the Hyper Bloom or Burgeon teams. Lastly, we have our weapons. EM weapons are going to be one of her best choices. Cloudforge, the 4.7 event bow, is only capable of maxing out one stack in the passive, since Ranmei's cooldown is 18 seconds. She can't get the second stack in time to get the full bonus, unless you have maybe some sort of cooldown reduction. Windbloom and Stringless provide attack and damage percent bonuses respectively, though Ranmei's personal damage isn't that amazing, so these aren't necessarily broken weapons on her either. It's a similar case for a weapon like Chainbreaker as well. You can get EM from the passive, but the substats being attack make it less valuable. ER weapons are also a good choice for her energy needs. Favonius is only worth it if you decide to build crit rate on her, But if you focus on EM stats, the lack of crit only makes this weapon a stat stick, not a team support weapon. Sacrificial Bow might work to allow for double particles. I do think, however, higher refinements are more necessary for consistency to this effect. As for 5-star options, Elegy of the End is an amazing option for Ruan Mei. Its ER substat helps with her energy needs, she gets a flat 60 EM bonus, and her burst hits multiple times, allowing her to trigger the Millennial Movement effect for that 100 EM and 20% attack. As for her signature weapon, I was able to honor the original light cone it's based off, even though I changed Ruan Mei's kit quite a bit. It has break effect bonuses, a team-wide damage bonus, an energy regen passive, and an interesting effect for granting a skill point in the scenario that you can hit a break effect break point. The T-to-T version with the bow will be called Mirror's Past Self, and it will have a 608 base attack and 198 EM substat. For its passive, casting a burst increases all allies' elemental damage of their element by 24 to 48%, which lasts for 20 seconds. If the user's EM exceeds or is equal to 450 when this happens, they also regenerate 8 to 16 energy for all allies, and increase the party's bloom damage by 120 to 240% for 20 seconds. Energy regen can only occur once every 10 seconds. Unlike other weapons where it's very hyper-specific to the character, this one has a pretty strong baseline passive. Any unit can use their burst and grant a team-wide 24% damage bonus. Universally accessible and usable. The second part of the passive requires an EM breakpoint of 450, which is a lot harder to reach for most characters. The main incentive there is that energy regen, since that effect is more universal. Meanwhile, the bloom bonus is there for more of the Ruan Mei specialty. Ignoring the bonuses entirely, who in the bow roster can even reach this threshold easily? The most obvious one is Tighnari, who mainly specializes in EM scaling for quicken or spread. Secondly, Venti on an EM-focused swirl build will hit this threshold pretty easy as well. Sethos can only use this weapon if you actually play his burst playstyle. Doing the manual charge attacks reduces energy, but wouldn't count as using his burst. Finally, Fischl is capable of reaching this point if you focus on certain EM stat builds, though it may be a little harder for her to build. For Ruan Mei in particular, she has no problems reaching this 450 EM point, and every bonus is relevant to her kit and party. Elemental damage bonuses contribute to both personal damage and the Break Bloom formulas. The energy regen passive is a great way to reduce her and her team's energy needs. Finally, the bloom bonus specifies itself as her signature weapon, since no other bow user would really utilize a bloom-based passive. As for the energy regen having a cooldown, it's more of a future-proof thing. Units like Veressa have an ability where they can cast their burst multiple times in quick succession. If a bow user were to ever release with this mechanic, they could just build the 450 EM and abuse the energy mechanic. A cooldown just prevents this from happening. Let's wrap up with talking about Ruan Mei's playstyle and best team comps. Ruan Mei was designed to be a unit who maximizes her utility in a pure bloom team. She enables the break bonus for bloom damage, which can be used to improve your bloom cores and blossoming bud. But because a bud records damage when a bloom core is created, this gives Ruan Mei the flexibility to still run Hyper Bloom or Burgeon teams. It may prevent her break buffs from buffing your on-field core damage, but it still takes into account bonuses for your blossoming bud. This prevents a Kaveh situation where running him in Hyper Bloom or Burgeon completely negates his bloom damage buff. Speaking of, Ruan Mei actually gives a significant buff to Kaveh. Two of Kaveh's many issues are his EM contribution to Bloom and his inability to play in non-pure Bloom teams. For his EM contribution, if he's acting as the aura, his EM is not relevant to Bloom's damage. Ruan Mei enabling a Bloom break bonus allows Kaveh to now contribute his EM to a Bloom core. This mechanic also works for other Dendro units like Nahida or Alhaitham, who also act more as a bloom aura, not a trigger. Secondly, when a core is created, it takes into account Kaveh's bloom damage bonus from his burst, and this is automatically recorded in the blossoming bud. In the same way that Ranmei can flexibly work with Hyper Bloom or Burgeon, Kaveh can now function in the same way. Even if these two reactions are triggered on a core, the initial bloom bonuses were already recorded, so it won't completely negate those pieces of utility. As for other forms of a pure bloom team, I'd say the other massive synergy is Nilou. The bountiful cores are still considered bloom damage and benefit from break bonuses. This means your already deadly cores are even deadlier. Since these cores still explode slower than the damage it's recorded, the Blossoming Bud can record those damage instances and have a higher damage instance per explosion. We've also already taken into account the self-damage with that 85% bloom resistance, so team survivability should still be manageable. As for the variant teams, Hyper Bloom or Quick Bloom teams lose out on the on-field cores benefiting from the break bonus, but you balance that out with the benefit of Hyper Bloom already having a higher damage floor. If Quicken is also more prevalent, you also allow Dendro or Electro units to buff their personal damage. And finally, the A4 bonus allows you to deal more frequent instances of a Blossoming Bud. You basically sacrifice the on-field core buffing and replace it with more personal buffs. For Burgeon, it's kind of the same thing. Higher damage floor with a Burgeon multiplier, but depending on application, Burning and Vaporize hinders your bloom output, which inherently nerfs your Blossoming Bud. So for that A4 passive, I was a lot more generous with that Pyro-related damage buff, so that I could balance out the lack of external utility a Pyro unit provides. In short, Pure Bloom has lower Bud damage, but is able to buff all Bloom cores. Hyper Bloom doesn't buff on-field core damage, but it allows for more frequent Bud hits as well as possible Quicken synergy. And Burgeon doesn't buff on-field cores, but it allows each Bud to deal significantly higher damage. There's also a scenario where you can run a Dendro, Hydro, Pyro, and Electro team. This creates less overall Bloom cores, resulting in a lower Bud damage baseline, but this can benefit from both a damage bonus and faster Bud explosions. Overall, every single Ranmei team variant has their sets of pros and cons, which provides different values based on what you run. I think designing her in this way not only makes her flexible in multiple teams, it also makes her role in these teams feel unique, and it makes her contribution in each team feel more balanced. This is the first episode that follows my new direction for T2T, and I'm really glad I started trying out this new format. Instead of making Ranmei yet another general buffer, I thought of her more as a specialized unit for bloom-based teams. I like to believe that the way she's designed allows her to function well as a regular bloom buffer, even in teams where Hyper Bloom and Burgeon occur. This new direction also allowed me to test run some of the original mechanics I made, such as the break formula or the raw elemental damage. You can very much expect to see more videos covering crazier and unique takes on character kit design moving forward in this series. Alright, that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on Ranmei's T2T kit design. What do you like, and what would you change? If you have ideas for alternate or original concepts, consider joining my Discord server. You can share ideas with our community and receive feedback from a variety of people. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I will see you all next time. Bye!